The man behind the desk had the particular kind of patience that comes from never having needed anything. He sat with his hands folded over the land register, his reading
This pipe
spectacles
runs
pushed to
directly
the end
to
of
the
a nose
condenser,
that had grown
bypassing the
accustomed to looking
regulator.
down.
But if the pressure
And he
builds...
regarded the woman standing across from him the way a man regards weather as something to be waited out. Wren Calloway did not wait to be invited to sit. She pulled the chair back, herself, settled into it with the directness of someone who had learned that waiting for permission was a tax only certain people paid, and she placed the folded survey map on the desk between them before he could speak first. He unfolded it, looked at the parcel marked in pencil, looked up. That land floods 6 months out of 12, Mrs. Calloway. His voice carried the gentleness of a man who believed he was being kind. The river basin backs up every spring thaw. Every family that's tried to work that stretch has given it up inside of 2 seasons. It's not farmable ground. It's barely passable ground. Wren's hands rested in her lap. Her coat was clean, but the cuffs were worn, and she made no effort to hide this. Then the price should reflect that. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked at the money she had placed beside the map, counted out in bills and coin exact to the dollar. No rounding, no approximation, and something shifted in his expression that was not quite respect, but was at least recognition. He signed. She did not thank him effusively. She took the deed, folded it with the same care she'd folded the map, and walked out of the Cutter County Land Office into the April light of 1883 with her son's hand in hers and 8 months of planning becoming at last a fact in the world. Eli was 6 years old and did not ask why they were taking the Badland. He had learned in the 3 years since his father died that his mother's silences were not empty, they were load-bearing. He walked beside her through the mud of the main street of Harwick, the nearest town of consequence to Greystone Hollow, watching her eyes move across the storefronts, the mill, the blacksmith sign cataloging things, the way his father had once taught her to catalog rock seams in a mine wall, not for what they were, but for what they indicated. Owen Calloway had died in March of 1880 in a haulage tunnel 40 feet below the surface of a coal operation outside Sedalia, Missouri. The beam that gave way was later determined to have been insufficiently braced, a conclusion that arrived 6 weeks after the funeral and did nothing for anyone. He was 31 years old. He left behind a wife, a son not yet 4, a set of geological survey tools, and a habit of explaining the physical world in terms that assumed the listener was intelligent enough to follow. That assumption had been the best thing he ever gave her. The mule was tied outside the feed store where she'd left him. Eli climbed up onto the wagon seat without being lifted and sat with his legs dangling, watching the street with the patient attention of a child who has spent a great deal of time waiting on adults to finish their business. Wren loaded the last of her supplies seed bags, a coil of copper pipe she'd traded for at the salvage yard 2 towns back, a box of cut nails and a folded oilskin she'd been carrying since Kansas, then climbed up beside him and clicked her tongue at the mule. "Mama," Eli said after a mile of silence and river smell, "is it ours now?" "It's ours now." He thought about this. Even the wet parts, especially the wet parts. He seemed to find this satisfactory. He watched a hawk move in long, unhurried circles above the tree line, and Wren watched the road, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was the particular quality of their silences. Not strained, not sad, just full of things that didn't need saying out loud. The parcel that Cutter County had been trying to unload for 11 years sat at the northern end of Greystone Hollow, pressed against a basalt shelf that rose 40 feet above the valley floor and bent slightly westward, creating a natural windbreak for anything built close against it. The ground was soft, yes, saturated in places, black-earthed, the kind of ground that swallowed fence posts and breathed with the water table. But it was also clay-rich below the first 8 inches, which meant it would seal around a foundation instead of shifting, and it sat 2 full feet above the river's highest recorded mark, which Wren had found in a territorial survey document at the county library in Boise before she'd ever set foot in the valley. She had chosen this land the way Owen had taught her to choose a tunnel brace, not by what looked strongest, but by what failed last. The neighbors introduced themselves over the first week in the way that neighbors do in places where gossip travels faster than goodwill. The Merritt family from the adjacent plot, Wallace Merritt and his wife Dorothea, both church-going, both well-meaning, in the particular way of people who have never been tested, came by on the 3rd day with a pie and a series of barely concealed questions about her marital status, her finances, her intentions. Wren accepted the pie, answered what she chose to answer, and went back to digging her foundation trenches before they'd finished their coffee. The O'Shea family, Patrick and his wife Marta, 3 children under 10, lived a quarter-mile east and came by on the 5th day. Patrick O'Shea was a compact, quiet-handed man with the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of physical work, and he looked at Wren's foundation lines with an expression that was not dismissive, only thoughtful. "You're building close to the rock face," he said. "Wind comes off the ridge from the northwest. The basalt breaks it." He looked at the rock face, then back at the ground she'd already cleared. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he's revising his initial assessment. He did not offer unwanted advice. She noted this. The others she cataloged in the same methodical way she cataloged everything the Prentice brothers, who farmed the western slope and whose humor ran to the kind of jokes that required an audience to feel smart. The widow Aldridge, who was 80, if she was a day, watching Wren's progress from her porch with an expression of ancient, patient interest. The school teacher, a thin-wristed man named Aldous Peck, who kept his hat on indoors and spoke in a cadence that suggested he'd once been told he had a fine voice, and various others who moved through the valley's daily rhythms like planets in a known orbit, predictable, self-referential, suspicious of the new gravitational forces. Douglas Harp she did not meet until the 3rd week, which she later understood was intentional on his part. He came on a Tuesday morning when she was framing the upper wall supports, her hammer moving in the steady 3-beat rhythm position set drive that she'd developed over the past year of working alone. She heard the horse before she saw the man, a well-kept roan with the kind of grooming that signals disposable income, and she did not stop working when he reined in at the edge of her cleared land. He was 52 years old, built like a man who had once done serious physical work, and now directed others to do it instead, broad through the chest gray at the temples, wearing a coat that was practical without being humble. He had the face of someone who smiled readily enough that you were halfway through deciding you liked him before you'd thought to wonder why he was smiling. "Harp," he said from the horse. "Douglas Harp. I run the Harp operation east of the creek cattle, some timber, a mill lease on the Greystone tributary." He paused, letting the inventory of his holdings settle into the air between them. "Heard someone had finally taken on the basin parcel. Wanted to come see." Wren set the next nail, drove it in 3 strokes. "Wren Calloway. You're building the upper frame wide," Harp said. Not a criticism, an observation offered like a gift, which was how he offered most things. She would later understand, wrapped in the appearance of neutral interest. "I am. Mind if I ask what you're planning for the roof structure? Most folks frame thinner on account of snow load, lighter, easier to replace if a section goes." She looked at him for the first time directly. His expression was exactly what it had appeared to be from the side, open, curious, pleasant. Nothing moved behind his eyes that she could read, which was itself information. "I've got my reasons," she said, and went back to the frame. He stayed another few minutes asking about the land purchase, about whether she'd found the water table manageable, about where she'd sourced her lumber, all questions that had obvious surface purposes and slightly less obvious secondary ones. She answered what she chose to answer in the same proportion she'd answered the merits. When he finally touched the brim of his hat and turned the roan back toward the creek road, he did so without hurry, without anything that could be called rudeness. He left no visible trace of what he'd come to find out. But Wren stood for a moment after the sound of hooves faded, her hammer resting against her thigh, and thought about the questions he had asked versus the questions he had not asked. He hadn't asked where she was from, hadn't asked about her husband, which everyone else had asked within 4 sentences, hadn't asked how long she planned to stay. He'd asked about the roof. The blacksmith shop sat at the near end of Harwick's Main Street, set back slightly from the road, with a sign that had weathered past legibility, but still swung in the wind with a kind of stubborn persistence. Calhoun Metz had operated it for 23 years, which in Greystone Hollow made him a kind of geological feature, something you oriented yourself by rather than something you actually looked at. He was 68, gray-bearded, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same material as his anvil, and he had the slow, specific intelligence of a man who had spent decades solving problems that did not tolerate imprecision. Wren came to him into the 5th week with a length of the copper pipe she'd salvaged and a question about bending radius. He looked at the pipe, looked at the sketch she unrolled on his workbench, said nothing for a period of time that would have made most people fill with nervous explanation. She waited. Where does this loop run? His finger traced the line she'd drawn from the flue channel up through the joist space, through the upper frame, along the inside face of the rafter cavity, then back down the opposite side to the secondary flue outlet. You're using the chimney heat to warm the cavity. Convection. Hot air rises through the loop, dries whatever's stored in the rafter space, exits through the upper outlet before it can back up into the living space. He looked at the sketch again, at the copper pipe, at the sketch again. You'd need to seal the cavity from the interior ceiling. Otherwise, you get smoke migration. Tar-soaked canvas over the lower joist faces. Cedar tongue and groove on the ceiling below that. 2 layers. A silence. You've thought about this. For about a year and a half. He picked up the copper pipe, turned it in his hands, assessed it the way he assessed everything. Brought into his shop, not for what it was sold as, but for what it would actually do under load. I can get this radius without cracking it, he said finally. But you'll want the bends at 30 degrees, not 45. Less resistance to the airflow. 30 degrees, she agreed. Yeah. He set it down. Looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since she came in, which was the way he looked at a piece of metal that had turned out to be a different alloy than expected. Not disappointed, just recalibrating. I've seen one other roof built like this, he said. Not exact, but close. 1858. I was doing apprentice work for a builder up in Vermont. A widow woman ran a farm alone after her husband took a fever. Built her roof twice as thick as any neighbor. He paused, smoothing a thumb along the edge of the workbench. We all figured she'd gone soft in the head from grief. Wren said nothing. That winter, the cold came in November and didn't let go until April. Her neighbors' woodsheds froze solid locks on the doors, seized wood inside went damp from ice melt through the gaps. Half of them burned furniture by February. Metz picked up a rag, wiped his hands with the methodical attention of a man organizing his thoughts. I slept in her barn for 2 weeks because it was warmer than my own room at the boarding house. Never laughed at her again after that. Never told anyone I'd laughed in the first place. He went to heat the pipe section and Wren rolled her sketch back up, and neither of them made more of it than it was. But as she was leaving, he said without looking up from the forge, Harp came by yesterday, asked what you'd bought from the salvage yard. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. I told him pipe fittings, Metz said. Which is true. Thank you. I didn't do it as a favor. He worked the bellows twice. I did it because a man who asks that question before he asks whether your roof will hold in a snow load is a man whose interests I don't particularly trust. She walked back to her wagon. Eli was sitting in the wagon bed with his knees up using a nail to scratch something into a scrap of wood. He looked up when she climbed into the seat, looked at her face, looked back at his wood scrap. Are we getting the copper bent? He asked. We're getting the copper bent. Good, he said, and went back to his scratching, and that was all. The frame went up through June in stages the way anything real is built, not in the dramatic single push of stories told afterward, but in the accumulated hours of problems solved one at a time. The lower walls were standard enough that no one paid much attention. Vertical log construction, chinking with river clay and dry grass, standard window openings on the south and east faces to catch morning light. It was when the upper framing began that the comments started. The roof structure was the thing. From outside, it looked like a miscalculation. The pitch was conventional enough, but the depth of the rafter cavity was nearly 3 feet far beyond what any snow load calculation would require, and the outer sheathing boards were spaced in a way that left the inside of the cavity accessible through a series of narrow hatches fitted along the east interior wall. To anyone who looked, it appeared to be the work of someone who didn't understand what a roof was for. This interpretation proved popular. The first comment came from one of the Prentice brothers riding past on a July morning when Wren was fitting the third course of upper framing. He pulled up, looked at the structure, looked at his brother, looked back at the structure, with the particular expression of a man who has identified something funny and is deciding how funny to perform it. You building yourself an ark up there, Mrs. Calloway? The brother beside him started laughing before the sentence was finished, which was the tell. The laugh was already loaded, waiting for a hook to hang on. Wren drove the next nail, said nothing. She's going to store her good china up there, the second one offered. Keep it safe from the spring floods. She drove another nail. The joke, deprived of reaction, deflated, and they rode on, and she had 2 more courses framed before noon. The comments accumulated the way weather accumulates slowly, then all at once. By August, it had become a kind of communal recreation, not vicious, not yet, but with the particular thoughtless energy of people who have agreed without discussing it that someone is an acceptable target. At the feed store, at the church steps on Sunday mornings, at the creek crossing, where the paths of several homesteads converge the widow's roof. The widow's peculiar roof. What on earth was she doing with that roof? Eli heard everything. He was a child who moved through adult spaces with a quietness that made people forget he was present, and he collected information the way his mother collected survey documents, not for the pleasure of having it, but against the possibility of needing it. It was Eli who noticed first that the wood was going missing. He didn't say anything to Wren immediately. This was not from fear or uncertainty. It was from the same instinct his mother had when she stood at a problem, which was to gather sufficient evidence before speaking. For 3 mornings running, he went to the side of the cabin before breakfast and counted the split logs stacked against the lower east wall, the overflow that hadn't yet been moved into the roof cavity. He did this with the nail-scratched piece of scrap wood he kept in his coat pocket, marking each count in small, careful lines. On the 4th morning, he handed her the scrap wood over breakfast. 4 rows of marks, each row slightly smaller than the one above it. She looked at it, looked at him. "How long have you been counting?" 4 days. He looked at his porridge. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." The difference between the first count and the 4th was 11 logs. Not a windfall, not a settling shift. 11 split logs gone from a stack that was sheltered on 3 sides. She went outside after breakfast and looked at the ground. The mud near the stack held the edge of a boot print, a man's wide-toed, the left heel worn down at a distinctive angle. She didn't go to any neighbor, didn't speak of it at the feed store or the church steps. She built the wall of the lower east storage into the cabin's interior that week, moving the remaining surface stack inside, and the following Saturday she spent 4 hours fitting the interior hatch system along the east wall with latches that required a specific sequence of movements to open the kind of mechanism that was not locked precisely, but that would not yield to someone unfamiliar with its logic. Then she replaced the 11 logs with 11 others, stacked them in the original location, and left them there for 1 week. On the 8th day, she counted them again. All present. Whatever message the original theft had been intended to send, the response, no confrontation, no accusation, quiet replacement, had sent a different one. She was not certain who had received it or how clearly, but the stack was not touched again. The copper pipe went in during the 2nd week of August, on a day when the sky was the color of old brass and the air smelled of coming change. Metz had bent the sections to 30-degree angles as agreed, and had added, without being asked, a set of small baffles at each bend to reduce turbulence, the kind of extra quarter-inch of thought that was his actual signature on any piece of work. Wren fitted them through the rafter cavity, with Eli handing pieces up through the lower hatch, the two of them working in the focused silence they'd developed over years of being each other's only consistent company. The loop ran from a point 6 inches above the firebox, up through the east wall cavity, across the upper rafter space along the north face, back down the west cavity, and exited through a secondary flue outlet she'd built into the upper chimney structure. A bifurcated design that allowed the primary smoke to exit normally, while the heat convected through the loop before venting. The clay packing around the pipe sections would absorb and radiate heat slowly like a stone warmed in the afternoon sun. The wood stored in the cavity would sit in air that never dropped below a useful temperature, never accumulated the moisture that turned split logs to slow rot. She knew this would work because she had tested a model of it, a small version, built in a wooden box over a lamp in a rented room in Dodge City, 18 months before she'd bought the land deed. She had spent 11 evenings with the model and a thermometer and a piece of split oak, taking notes in the margin of the geological survey document she carried everywhere. When the oak in the model remained below 12% moisture content after 2 weeks of artificial humidity, she had written sufficient in the margin and started planning the full-scale version. Owen had taught her to test small before you bet large. He'd said it about tunnel bracing, but the principle held for everything that mattered. The first cord of wood went into the cavity on the 15th of August. Eli passed logs up through the hatch while Wren arranged them on the cedar shelves she'd fitted along the north rafter face bark. Side out, staggered for airflow, each row slightly elevated from the one below, on wooden runners to allow circulation underneath. They worked until the first section was full, then Wren latched the hatch and climbed down, and they stood back and looked at the roof from outside. It looked like a roof. It looked like an ordinary roof slightly thicker than standard sitting on an ordinary cabin built too close to the basalt shelf by a widow who didn't know better. Nobody can tell, Eli said. That's the point. He thought about this for a moment. What if someone needs to borrow some? Can they tell then? Wren looked at the roof for another moment, at the clean, ordinary line of the ridge, at the shingles she'd laid with a slight extra overhang on all four sides to divert meltwater from the wall faces. We'll think about that when we come to it. They came to it sooner than she'd planned because the season shifted in September without the decency of warning. There had been a wet summer, wet enough that the river ran high into August, which it rarely did, and the garden had required more drainage work than anticipated. The moisture in the ground going into September was already above normal. When the cold came, it came into saturated country. The first frost hit on September 9th, 3 weeks before the date the oldest settlers in the valley used as their planting mark. It came overnight without the gradual dropping degree announcement that usually preceded it, and by morning the garden was black at the edges, and the mud around the water barrel had a thin skin of ice that cracked when Eli stepped on it at dawn. He stood on it deliberately. Wren noticed breaking the ice in a careful grid, working methodically outward from center the way he did most things, and then he came inside and told her without drama that the barrel had a new crack at the base where the ice had pushed outward. She looked at the garden, looked at the sky which had the flat, textureless gray of coming sustained cold, smelled the air which had a particular quality, not the clean sharpness of ordinary autumn frost, but something drier, harder, with an edge that sat at the back of the throat. She went inside, put 3 more logs into the firebox, and took the survey document out of the leather case she kept it in. She had marked on the back of one page in the margins, alongside Owen's handwritten notes, about clay striation depths, the winters of record in the Idaho Territory, sourced from a combination of newspaper archives and territorial agency reports she'd read in Boise. 1875 had been bad, 1869 worse. 1856 had been what the old-timers called a killing winter, the kind that reshaped the population of any settlement unlucky enough to be in its path. The gap between killing winters in this region ran to somewhere between 20 and 30 years. It was 1883. She put the document back in its case. Outside, she could hear the sound of the valley starting to scramble, axes biting into rounds, the shout of men calling to each other across yards, the particular urgent pitch of work that has been deferred too long and is now proceeding in a panic. She stood at the window for a moment and watched the smoke beginning to rise from several chimneys, at once thin and pale against the flat sky, dissipating too quickly in air that would not hold heat. Then she put on her coat and went out to split the next cord. She was 3 hours into the work when Harp appeared at the edge of her land for the second time. He was on foot this visit, which she noted a man who comes on foot comes with more time to spend or less certainty about his reception. He stood at the property line with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her work for a moment before speaking. "Early frost," he said. "Yes. Your wood storage, you've got a fair amount going in, it looks like." His tone was the same as before, pleasant, informational, caring, nothing that could be called accusation. "You've been at it since June." She set another round on the block. "Since May, actually." A pause. "That's a lot of preparation for a first winter. Most newcomers don't know to start that early." She raised the axe. "Most newcomers don't have a reason to know." She brought it down. The round split clean. "I had a reason." He was quiet for a moment. "That roof cavity of yours, I've been trying to work out the design. You've got the chimney venting through it somehow, is that right? Seen some smoke behavior that suggests it." She gathered the 2 split halves, stacked them on the near pile, looked at him. His expression was the same open, curious, pleasant thing it always was, and she had learned by now that this expression was not a disguise so much as a tool, something he used the way she used the axe for a specific purpose, with no malice in the implement itself. "The chimney does what chimneys do," she said. "The roof does what roofs do." He smiled. "Fair enough." He looked at the cabin, at the roof, at the stacked wood beside the door. "You're going to be well set come February." There was something in the way he said it, not quite admiration, not quite resentment, that sat between the two like a stone in a cold creek, neither warm nor sharp, just present. He left without asking the question she'd sensed underneath all his other questions, The one he kept circling, not what the roof was, but how much was in it. That evening, Metz came by unannounced. This was unusual. He was not a visiting man. He had walked a mile and a half from his shop, which told her the visit had been decided on with some deliberateness. He sat in the chair she offered him, declined the coffee she offered, and said without preamble, "Harp came by my shop this afternoon." Wren waited. "Asked me whether I thought the materials I'd supplied for your roof would hold up under heavy snow load, whether there was any risk of structural failure." Metz ran his thumb along the seam of his coat, a habit she'd noticed he had when organizing what he wanted to say carefully. "I told him the materials were sound. He thanked me and left." He looked up. Then he stood outside my door for 4 minutes before mounting up. I counted. She poured herself coffee, sat across from him. What was he waiting for? I don't know. Either he expected someone else to come out, or he was deciding something. Metz's hands rested on his knees still. "I've known Douglas Harp for 9 years. He is not a reckless man. He does not ask questions he doesn't intend to use the answers to." "I know. I'm telling you because I've seen men like him operate in 3 different places, and they are most dangerous not when they're opposed, but when they're ignored. He's used to being the largest force in a room. When something doesn't respond to him the way he expects, he recalibrates." Wren held her coffee cup in both hands. Outside, the wind had come up from the northwest. She could hear it against the basalt shelf, deflected down over the cabin roof, broken into something manageable. The chimney drew steady. "What would you have me do differently?" she asked. Not defensively, a genuine question, the kind she asked Eli when she wanted his unfiltered assessment. Metz looked at her for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "I'd have you do nothing differently." He stood, retrieved his hat from his knee. "I just wanted you to know I'm not going to tell him anything he asks me." He moved toward the door. "Suggest you think carefully about who else in this valley you trust with what's in that roof." He left. She sat with her coffee until it was cold, listening to the wind break against the basalt and run over the ridge of her roof in a long, deflected sigh. Before she went to bed, she took the key Metz had quietly pressed into her hand, at the end of August delivered with a folded note that read simply, "If I don't come through this winter, take what you need," and she put it in the tin box she kept under the floorboard with the land deed and Owen's survey tools. Then she went to the east wall, opened the lower hatch, and counted the logs in the first cavity section by touch in the dark, the way Owen had taught her to count tunnel supports, not because she doubted the count, but because a hand on a thing is different from a number on a page, and there are kinds of knowing that only the body can confirm. The wood was dry, warm to the touch from the slow circulation of heat through the copper loop, the way bread is warm from the inside of a cooling oven, not hot, not burning, just holding what had been given to it. She latched the hatch, went to bed. Eli was already asleep, his breathing the slow, trusting rhythm of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of the night. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about the angle of Harp's questions, and thought about Metz's 4 minutes of counted silence outside the shop door, and thought about the boot print in the mud with the worn left heel. And she put these things in order, the way she put logs in order by size, by density, by what they would give when burned, and when she had arranged them to her satisfaction, she closed her eyes. The cold was coming, the real cold, the kind that didn't announce itself or apologize. She was ready for it. The question that remained, the one she could not yet answer, was whether being ready would be enough when the people around her discovered they were not. The morning of September 14th brought the first serious defection from pleasantness. Wren was at the water barrel when Dorothy Merritt came across the field with a shawl pulled tight at her throat and an expression that combined genuine worry with the particular social discomfort of someone about to say something they've been rehearsing. "We've been talking," Dorothy began, which in Wren's experience was a way of distributing ownership of what was coming. "Wallace and I, some of the others," she looked at the roof, "about the wood." Wren filled the bucket, said nothing. "It's just people are saying you've got an awful lot stored up there. We're all a little concerned about the fire risk with it being so close to the chimney structure and—" She stopped, restarted. "It's not that anyone begrudges you your preparation. It's more that if there were to be an emergency and folks needed—" "How much wood have you put up, Dorothy?" Wren asked. Not unkindly. Dorothy blinked. "Wallace has cut quite a bit. We've got the shed." "Is it full?" A pause. "Mostly." "Then you're fine." Wren picked up the full bucket. "When you're not fine, come talk to me." It was not a dismissal. She said it as a statement of fact in the same tone she'd have used to say the creek runs north here, accurate and without edge. But Dorothy Merritt went away with the expression of someone who had been dismissed, which was its own kind of information about what she'd been hoping to hear. The Wood comments multiplied through the second and third weeks of September, gathering the particular momentum that community criticism gains when the weather confirms the anxiety behind it. The second hard frost came on the 21st, and the third 3 days after that, and by the end of the month, the garden was gone completely. Men who had been confident in their supply in August now looked at their woodsheds with revised arithmetic. Wren continued splitting. She had established a daily rhythm that she maintained with the same consistency she maintained the fire in the firebox, not from compulsion, but from the understanding that a rhythm once broken costs more to rebuild than it would have cost to keep. 4 hours of splitting in the morning, 2 hours of stacking and hatch loading in the afternoon, 1 hour of review in the evening, checking the moisture content of random logs with the small gauge she'd built from a bent wire and a piece of calibrated tin, recording the temperature in the cavity at 3 points along the copper loop, noting the wind direction in the margin of the survey document. Eli helped without being asked. He had developed his own rhythm alongside hers, tending the fire in the morning while she split carrying water, keeping count of the hatch sections as they filled, informing her of things he observed with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who understood that the value of information lay in its accuracy, not its delivery. It was Eli who told her about the second footprints. "These are different from before," he said one morning in early October, standing at the north face of the cabin and looking at the ground with the focused attention he gave to things that required attention. "Different boot, smaller. They go around twice." Wren looked at the tracks. He was right, the toe was narrower than the previous print, and the circuit had been made twice the second loop slightly inside the first, as though the person had walked a little closer on the second pass. She looked up at the roof line. Nothing was missing. The hatches were latched, but the person had stopped at each hatch point. She could see where the prints paused the small scuff of a weight shift and looked. She thought about what they would have seen: a latch, a seam, a section of roof that appeared slightly thicker than standard. She thought about who had enough knowledge of her design to know what they were looking at. She thought about Harp standing 4 minutes outside Metz's shop. She went inside and wrote down the date, the boot description, and the circuit count in the margin of her document, then spent the afternoon adding an additional latch to each hatch. Not a lock which would signal that she feared theft, but a second catch that required 2 simultaneous movements to release. The kind of mechanism that was obvious only if you already knew it was there. That evening, Metz arrived for the second unannounced visit, and this one she had been half expecting. He came in, sat, accepted coffee this time, and held the cup for a moment before he spoke. "Harp held a conversation at the feed store today," Metz said. "Dorothea Merritt was there, and she mentioned it to Wallace, who mentioned it to me because he thought I should know." He drank the coffee, set it down. He was talking about the dry season, the early frost, the general shortfall of preparation across the valley. Said it was the kind of situation where community resource sharing might need to be formalized. Said some folks had more than they'd need, and some had less, and that left to itself, that situation tended to resolve badly. Wren was very still. "He didn't use your name," Metz said. "He didn't need to. There are maybe 4 homesteads in the valley with a full season's wood put up, and 3 of those 4 belong to men who would be on his side of any agreement he proposed." He looked at his coffee cup. "He knows what's in your roof. I don't know how he knows, but he knows enough." She thought about Dorothy Merritt's visit, about the measuring quality of her questions about fire risk, the emergency scenario. She thought about how a conversation could be a survey without ever announcing itself as one. "He sent her," Wren said. Metz said nothing, which was confirmation. She stood, went to the shelf where she kept the survey document and the small journal she'd begun keeping in October, a log of every cord stacked, every conversation of consequence, every morning count, every unusual track or approach. "Cal," she said the first time she'd used his given name. He looked up. "If something happens to me, to this cabin, the journal is in the tin box under the floorboard. 3rd board from the east wall, 2nd from the hearth." He looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing's going to happen to you." She looked back. "You're a man who counts to 4, she said. "Count again and tell me you believe that." He was quiet. "Then the key to my shop. You still have it." "I have it." There's a second tin box on the back shelf, behind the flux cans, same kind of information in it. He picked up his coffee again. I've been keeping my own notes. Outside, the wind came off the basalt shelf and moved over the ridge of the roof with its familiar deflected sigh, and the chimney drew steady, and the copper loop carried its slow, warm circulation through the dry dark of the rafter cavity where the wood sat waiting dry as a promise kept. Wren sat back down across from the old man. They drank their coffee in the particular silence of two people who have understood the same thing at the same time and have chosen not to diminish it by explaining it to each other. The cold was no longer coming. It was here. The first day of sustained cold arrived without theater. No storm, no dramatic drop, just a morning when Wren stepped outside at dawn and understood in the particular way the body understands, before the mind catches up, that the temperature had crossed a threshold it would not recross for a long time. The air had a quality she recognized from Owen's descriptions of deep shaft cold, the kind that doesn't bite so much as settle, filling every space available to it with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. By noon, the garden beds were iron. By evening, the creek at the shallow crossing had stopped moving entirely, not frozen through, but glazed the current underneath audible. If you put your ear near the surface, a muffled, trapped sound like something trying to speak through glass. Eli noted the temperature at the 3 points Wren had taught him to measure: the outdoor post at shoulder height, the interior wall near the north face, the cavity access point at the first hatch. He wrote the numbers on his counting board and brought it to Wren without comment. The cavity was running 11 degrees warmer than the outdoor air. The copper loop was doing exactly what the model in the Dodge City room had told her it would do. She looked at the numbers, wrote them in the margin of the document, did not say anything about them being correct because correctness was not a surprise. It was the result of sufficient preparation, and surprising yourself with your own preparation was a kind of arrogance she had no use for. 3 miles east, the first of the valley's woodsheds gave way. She heard about it from Patrick O'Shea, who appeared at her door on the second morning of the cold, with the particular expression of a man who is not sure whether he is bringing information or asking for something. His hands were bare, he'd come fast without full preparation, and Wren stepped aside to let him in without being asked. The Prentice shed had gone overnight. Not collapsed under snow, the first real snow was still 2 weeks away, but the east wall had given at the base, where the ground moisture had wicked up into unseasoned timber, and the entire south-leaning structure had folded sideways, dumping 3 cords of split wood into the mud and slush that had accumulated at the low point of their yard. The wood was not ruined, not yet, but it was in contact with saturated ground, and in the temperatures now holding it would wick moisture from below, while the cold locked it from above, and in a week it would be wood in name only. O'Shea was not there to tell her about the Prentice brothers' misfortune out of neighborly concern. He was there because he had 4 children, including an infant, because his own shed was sound but his total supply was shorter than he'd told his wife, because he was a man who could do arithmetic, and the arithmetic was producing numbers he didn't like. Wren made coffee, sat across from him. Let him work up to what he'd come to say. "I've got maybe 6 weeks of wood at normal burning," O'Shea finally said. His voice was steady, factual. He was not a man who dressed things up. "If this cold holds the way old Aldridge says it will, that's short by 3 weeks at minimum." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I'm not asking for charity. I want to be clear about that." "What are you asking for?" He met her eyes. "Work. I'm a competent carpenter. I can do roof work. I know ironmongery well enough. If you need anything done, I'd work for wood. Fair exchange, not donation." Wren considered him. Not the proposition, she'd made up her mind about that before he finished the sentence, but him, the way he'd structured the offer, the specific word he'd chosen to exclude. Charity. The weight he put on it told her everything about what it cost him to be in her kitchen at all. "The south hinge on the cellar hatch has been loose since August," she said. "I've been putting it off." His shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch. "I can have that done in an hour. Come back tomorrow with your tools. We'll talk about what else needs doing." He finished his coffee, stood, and shook her hand with the grip of someone sealing an agreement, not expressing gratitude, entering a contract. She respected the distinction. He left. Eli, who had been sitting in the corner throughout the conversation, looked up. "He won't tell anyone he came here, will he?" "He might." Wren took both cups to the basin. "Why?" Eli scratched a mark on his board. Because if he tells people it worked, more people will come. But if he doesn't tell people, nobody will know. He looked at the mark he'd made. But they'll notice his house is warmer than theirs. She looked at her son for a moment. He was 6 years old and had his father's way of identifying the exact weight-bearing point of any situation, the place where everything else rested. They'll notice, she agreed. The snow came on the 28th of October, 2 weeks later than usual, but heavier than any opening snowfall in the past decade by the measure of the oldest settlers. It came overnight, and by morning, Greystone Hollow had been rewritten, every familiar shape buried or softened, the whole valley under a 1.5 feet of white that had the dense wet quality of snow that intends to stay. Wren was on her roof before full light, clearing the ridge with a long-handled push broom, while Eli kept the firebox fed below. She worked from the peak outward, pushing the snow off in controlled sections that fell clear of the walls, checking the shingle overhang she'd built on all 4 sides, an extra 4 inches, beyond standard enough to divert meltwater away from the foundation. The cavity hatches were sealed tight. The roof held its own weight with 10 inches of engineered tolerance to spare. She came down, made breakfast, recorded the temperature at all 3 points. Douglas Harp's woodshed did not collapse in the first storm. This was important to understand later. Harp was not careless. His shed was well built, properly pitched with a solid foundation. What he had done, what no one in the valley knew, because he had done it quietly over 3 separate transactions in late August, with buyers from 2 counties over, was sell 60% of his stored supply to cover a land deposit on a parcel he was acquiring to the north, a timber lease he'd been engineering for 2 years. He had planned to replenish before serious winter set in. He had made this plan in August, when the summer had been generous and the frost date had seemed reliably distant. September 9th had destroyed that calculation. So his shed stood. It was simply much emptier than it appeared, and Harp was now in the position of a man who has bet on a specific sequence of events and watched the sequence dissolve without being able to tell anyone why he was in trouble. What Harp did with his position was what Wren had known he would do from the moment she'd understood him. He converted private failure into public principle. The meeting at the Harwick Church on the 3rd of November was announced as a community planning session, winter preparedness, mutual aid, the kind of gathering that had genuine precedent in frontier settlements. 23 people came, which was most of the valley's adult population. Wren was not invited, which she registered without particular emotion, the way she registered the worn left heel boot print as information, not injury. Aldous Peck told her about it the following morning. The school teacher had the slightly damp look of a man who had been keeping something uncomfortable all night and was relieved to set it down. Harp had proposed a Valley Resource Committee, a group of 5 appointed members with Harp as chairman, empowered to conduct a census of available resources across all homesteads and to coordinate equitable distribution in the event of community hardship. The proposal had passed 14-6 with 3 abstentions. The 6 who voted against it were the O'Sheas, the Aldridge widow Metz, and 3 others Wren didn't know well. The 14 who voted for it were cold worried and responding to the particular comfort of organized authority in disorganized circumstances. Peck delivered the committee's formal notice 2 days later. A letter written in Harp's hand but signed by all 5 members requesting that Wren Calloway provide a full account of her stored wood supply to the committee within 72 hours, and requesting that she make available for communal consideration no fewer than 5 cords of her estimated supply to be redistributed at the committee's discretion. Wren read the letter twice, set it on the table. "Mama," Eli said, watching her face, "what does it say?" She looked at him, pulled the journal out of the survey document case. "Sit down. Write these down exactly as I say them." She dictated to him for 40 minutes, every cord stacked, every date of stacking, every person who had come to her property, every conversation of substance she could reconstruct, every track she documented. Eli wrote in his careful, slightly oversized hand, filling 3 pages. When they were done, she folded the pages, put them in the tin box with the land deed, pressed the floorboard back into place with her boot. Then she sat down at the table with the committee's letter and wrote a response in her smallest, clearest handwriting. "I am aware of the committee's formation. I will be pleased to discuss resource coordination with any committee member who comes to my property in person. I do not provide written inventories of private property to anybody whose authority derives from a meeting to which I was not invited." She sent it back with Peck, who read it on his way out, and whose expression cycled through several things before settling on something that was not quite admiration, but was close enough to be its neighbor. The first person to come to her door after the letter was not a committee member. It was Dorothea Merritt, who arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with no pretense of social purpose and eyes that had lost the comfortable softness they'd carried in September. The cold had already begun to do what sustained cold does to people: compress them, reduce them to essential structures. "We lost our wood," Dorothy said, standing on the porch without being invited in. "Not all of it, but the bottom two cords went to mold. We didn't stack them off the ground properly, and the moisture came up. Wallace says we have 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we burn low." Wren looked at her, waited. "I'm not asking for what you're not willing to give." Dorothy's voice had a quality it hadn't had before, stripped of the social wrapping, just the fact underneath. "But I'm asking. My youngest is 5. The cold at night is getting into the walls." Wren went inside, came back with her arms full, 2 small loads of split hickory, dry to the touch, still faintly warm from the cavity. She set them on the porch boards. "Stack them off the ground when you get home," Wren said. "On wood runners, not on stone. Conducts cold. Bank your firebox overnight instead of letting it die. You'll use less wood and hold more heat." Dorothy Merritt looked at the wood, then looked up with an expression that had come through gratitude and out the other side into a kind of remorse. She picked up the loads without speaking, walked back across the field with her arms full, and didn't look back. Eli watched from the window. "How much does that leave?" Wren looked at the cavity gauge. "Enough." "How much is enough?" She looked at him. "Enough means we don't count until we have to." It was the 3rd week of November when Metz stopped coming by. She went to his shop on a Wednesday, 3 days after she'd last seen him, and found the door unlatched, not open, just unlatched in the specific way of a door left by someone who didn't plan to be gone long. She went in. The forge was cold. The tools were in their places with the neat final arrangement of things that had been put away by someone who understood they were putting them away for the last time. In the back of the shop, behind the flux cans on the rear shelf, she found the second tin box. Inside it, 14 pages of notes in Metz's compressed mechanical handwriting. Dates, conversations, names. 3 separate exchanges with Harp documented in detail. Each one a variation on the same theme. Harp asking questions about Wren's roof, about its contents, about structural vulnerabilities, always framed as neighborly concern, always arriving at the same underlying question through a different approach. The last entry was dated November 18th. It read, "Harp asked today whether the latch mechanism on the north hatch could be compromised from outside without tools. I told him I didn't know the latch mechanism. He said he was asking theoretically. I said I didn't think in theoretical terms about other people's property. He left. I think I'm getting sick." Below it, in writing that was slightly less controlled than the rest, the writing of a man whose hands were no longer steady. "The key I gave WC opens the side door. The cash tin on the middle shelf is for Eli. Don't argue with me about this." She stood in the cold shop for a while with the tin box in her hands. Then she took the cash tin. She would argue with him later. She told herself, knowing she wouldn't put both tins in her coat pockets, latched the door behind her and walked the 1.5 miles home through snow that had begun to fall again in the slow, steady way that means it plans to continue. She told Eli that Metz had passed. Eli sat with this for a moment, then went outside and placed a riverstone flat gray the size of his palm in front of the unlit lantern hook beside Wren's door. When she asked him why there, he said, "So when someone walks past at night, they'll see the lantern is dark and know something's different." She did not correct the logic. It was in its way exactly right. The night the thieves came onto the roof, Wren was already awake. She had been awake for an hour, sitting at the table with the lamp turned low, reviewing Metz's notes for the 3rd time. The wind had shifted to come off the valley floor instead of the ridge, which meant it carried sound differently. She could hear things she normally couldn't. She heard the first footstep on the roof at 2 in the morning, not as a creak, but as a pressure change. The faint groan of a loaded surface taking unexpected weight at an unexpected point. She was at the east wall before the second footstep came. The wire and tin clanger she'd strung between the north and south hatch points, fine enough to be invisible in daylight against the shingle color set, 2 inches above the hatch surface, registered the contact she'd been waiting for. She'd briefed O'Shea 3 days earlier. He was in position now, she trusted, at the base of the north face. She did not go to the roof. She went to the east wall, opened the lower interior access, reached through to the copper loop's secondary valve, a quarter-turn shutoff she'd fitted at the loop's highest point, specifically for this circumstance, and turned it closed. With the circulation cut, the heat in the cavity began to accumulate at the apex rather than distributing. Within 8 minutes, the upper sheathing boards would be warm enough that anyone pressing their hands against them from outside would feel the heat, but not hot enough to be anywhere near its combustion point, just hot enough to make a man rethink his position on someone else's roof in the dark. She heard them talking muffled through the boards, two voices, one sharper than the other. Then the sound of hands on the hatch latch trying the standard pull. Then silence as the second catch held. Then a different kind of force being applied, wood beginning to give. Then a voice, "It's hot. The wood is hot, what in hell?" Followed immediately by O'Shea's whistle from the north face, 3 short blasts, his signal that he was present, a witness with a name. The scramble off the roof took about 45 seconds. She heard one of them slip at the eave, a sliding, scraping sound followed by a thud in the snow that was heavier than a clean landing. She would find blood on the snow at the north corner in the morning, and O'Shea would look at the abandoned pry bar in the drift. Look at the blood. Look at Wren, and his expression would carry the name he'd recognize in those two voices, but would not say out loud. They both understood that saying the name would require a set of consequences neither of them was positioned to enforce. So the name stayed between them unspoken, where it would keep until it was useful. In the morning, Wren reopened the copper valve. Checked the hatch boards. 2 were cracked at the outer face where the pry bar had bitten, cosmetic damage only. She replaced them from the small supply of cut boards she kept in the cellar, which she kept precisely because things needed replacing. Eli had slept through the whole event. She didn't tell him about it in detail. She told him the hatches had needed a repair, which was true. The committee's second letter arrived on the 22nd of November. Its tone was different from the first, less formal, more urgent, with a sentence near the end that read, "The committee notes that non-cooperation during a period of community emergency reflects poorly on the character of any resident who places individual interest above collective welfare." Harp had not signed it first this time. He had put his name third, which Wren recognized as a repositioning. He was no longer the face of the pressure, just a member of a chorus. She wrote back on the same day, "I refer the committee to my previous response. I have provided assistance voluntarily to 11 residents of this valley since October. I keep my own record of what I have given and to whom. I will continue to provide assistance as I am able according to my own judgment about need and my own assessment of my supply. I do not recognize the committee's authority to compel inventory disclosure or mandatory contribution from private property. If any member of this valley is in genuine emergency need, they are welcome to come to my door." She kept a copy of both letters in Metz's tin box. The genuinely desperate came in the first week of December. Not the committee, not the organized pressure. The people beneath all of that, the ones for whom the political maneuvering was an abstraction because they were too busy trying to stay warm. Aldous Peck came on a Tuesday. He was thin enough that the cold showed on him structurally. His shoulders were up near his ears, his face reduced to the essential geometry of cheekbone and jaw. He did not say he was cold. He said his students could no longer come to school because 2 families had decided the fuel cost of getting children dressed was more than they could manage, and he was going to their homes instead. But the homes were getting cold enough that he was worried about the children's concentration. He had come to ask if she had any wood to spare for 2 specific families, the Hanleys whose father had broken his hand in October, and the Greer family whose woodpile had gone to mice in the walls of their shed. Wren gave him what she could for both. She loaded it onto the small sled she'd built in September, the one with the wide runners she'd designed for deep snow, and she pulled it herself to the Hanley place, then the Greer place, with Eli walking alongside carrying the lighter pieces. At neither home did she ask to come in. She left the wood stacked on the porch, knocked once, waited for the sound of footsteps inside, then left. Eli said nothing until they were most of the way home. His breath came in small white puffs, evenly spaced. "Are we going to run out?" Wren pulled the sled. "Not before spring. But we might run low. There's a difference between low and out." She looked straight ahead at the path. "Low means careful. Out means something different." He was quiet for a moment. "What does careful look like?" "It looks like what we're already doing." He accepted this with a small nod. The nod of a child who has learned that precision in language is not pedantry but survival, that the difference between the words matters as much as the difference between the conditions they describe. The night Sadie Pruitt knocked on Wren's door was a Thursday in the second week of December, and Wren had been awake since midnight with a low-grade unease. She couldn't source the kind of alertness that isn't triggered by any specific sound, but by an absence of the sounds that should be there. The knock was so quiet she almost missed it. 3 taps carefully spaced as though the person on the other side was concerned about waking the house. She opened the door. The girl was 16, 17 at most. Wren put her at the younger edge because of the way she stood still, carrying the slight forward lean of someone who hasn't yet grown into her height. She held a bundle against her chest wrapped in grain sacking, and the bundle moved. Her lips had the white, waxy quality of early frostbite at the margins, and her hands, one holding the bundle, one pressed flat against her own sternum, as though to check her own heartbeat, were bare. No gloves. She had been walking for a while. Wren did not ask questions. She opened the door, wide, stepped back. The girl came in. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the fire with an expression that was not relief, but something more fundamental. The expression of a body registering warmth as information, after a period in which warmth had become theoretical. The bundle against her chest shifted. A small sound came from it, more breath than cry, the sound of an infant too tired to make a proper demand. Wren took the kettle off the hook, filled it from the water barrel, hung it back. Put the lamp up higher. Then she turned to the girl and waited. Sadie. The girl's teeth were chattering badly enough that the word came out in pieces. Sadie Pruitt. My father, he dug a trench shelter north of our property. The runoff came in and then it... She stopped, started again. It froze. From the outside, we couldn't... Another stop. Her jaw was shaking too hard to finish the sentence, but she finished it anyway because some things require finishing regardless of the physical cost. I got Jasper out. I couldn't get back. Wren crossed the room, took the baby from her arms without asking permission, because permission was a consideration for warmer circumstances, unwrapped the outer grain sacking. The baby was alive, she could see that, in the first second alive, and alert in the particular startled way of a very young child who has been cold and is suddenly not blinking at the lamplight with an expression that was pure present tense. She carried Jasper to the chair nearest the firebox, unwrapped him to check his hands and feet. Pink, not white, no tissue damage she could see, and rewrapped him in the wool blanket she kept folded on the chair's arm. She had put it there in October without a specific plan for it, the way you prepare for things you can feel coming without being able to name them. Eli appeared in the doorway of the sleeping area, sleep crumpled, taking in the scene with the quiet, comprehensive attention that was simply his nature. He looked at Sadie, looked at Jasper, looked at Wren. Wren met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. He disappeared back through the doorway and came back a moment later with his own blanket, which he draped over Sadie's shoulders with the matter-of-fact care of someone performing a task they understand completely. He was 7 years old. He went back to the kitchen area, pulled a stool to the counter, began heating the broth Wren kept in the covered pot on the back of the stove, because he had seen his mother do this enough times to know it was what came next. Wren looked at Sadie. The girl was sitting on the floor near the firebox because she hadn't been able to make it to the chair, and she was rocking very slightly with the rhythm of someone whose body is attempting to comfort itself. Her eyes were dry. She had already moved past the place where crying was the thing that happened. Jasper is fine, Wren said. He's cold, but he's fine. Sadie nodded once tightly as if the nod were an expenditure she had budgeted carefully. You're going to stay here tonight, both of you. Another tight nod. Eli brought the broth in the small cup he'd learned to heat things in, not too hot, he'd been taught, because too hot is another problem, and set it beside Sadie on the floor. She wrapped both hands around it and drank it in the focused, continuous way of someone fueling a body that has issued a clear directive. Later, when Sadie was asleep in the cot Wren had set up near the firebox with Jasper tucked along her side, Wren sat at the table with the lamp turned down to its lowest useful level and the journal open in front of her. She wrote down the date, Sadie's name, Jasper's approximate age, the condition they'd arrived in the account of the trench shelter as Sadie had described it. She wrote it precisely because she understood already that she was not simply recording what had happened tonight. She was recording the shape of what was coming. The cold had taken a trench. It had taken a man she respected. It had driven a teenage girl through the dark with an infant in her arms. These were not isolated events. They were the early structure of something larger, the opening moves of a winter that had not yet decided how serious it intended to be. She closed the journal, sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the fire, to Sadie's slow breathing, to Jasper's smaller breath inside it, to Eli's steady rhythm from the sleeping area, to the wind moving in the new direction it had taken 3 days ago, carrying the valley's sounds differently, bringing things she would need to hear. She was not afraid. Fear was a response to uncertainty, and she had reduced her uncertainties as far as reduction was possible. What remained was not uncertainty, but exposure, the irreducible fact of being one person in a cold place, with a finite supply surrounded by people who were frightened, a man who was cornered, and a winter that was not finished making its decisions. She went to bed. When she slept, it was without the half-watchfulness she'd maintained since October, because Sadie's presence in the room, another person awake in the way that people with something to protect stay awake, meant the night was not entirely hers to monitor alone. Outside, the snow continued. Inside, the copper loop carried its slow warmth through the dark of the rafter cavity patient as a kept promise, drying the wood that would keep them alive. The 5 torches appeared at the edge of the tree line on the 4th night of December, moving toward her cabin through the snow. She saw them from the window where she'd been standing for 20 minutes, not expecting them specifically, but expecting something. The committee's patience had a duration, and she'd been calculating it the way she calculated wood supply, as a finite resource with a predictable depletion rate. Harp had waited long enough to build sufficient community desperation. He had positioned himself carefully enough that what was coming toward her cabin now was not a mob technically. It was a delegation, with torches. She turned from the window. Sadie was awake in the corner, Jasper against her shoulder, eyes wide with the understanding of someone who has recently experienced what happens when shelter fails. Eli was standing in the doorway of the sleeping area, fully dressed. He had heard the torches before she'd seen them. She realized which meant he'd been listening for them. She crossed to the floor, pressed the 3rd board from the east wall, 2nd from the hearth, lifted it, looked at her son. "Count to 400, she said. "If you don't hear my voice before you reach 400, take Sadie out through the back passage. You know where it comes out." He looked at her for a long moment with his father's gray eyes in his mother's face. "I know," Eli said. "I've been counting the steps since September." She pressed her hand briefly to the side of his face. Then she straightened, walked to the door, put her hand on the latch, waited for the footsteps to reach the porch. She opened it before they could knock. Harp stood at the back of the group, which was exactly where she'd known he would be. The 5 men stopped at the porch edge, the way men stop when they've rehearsed an arrival but not a reception. Harp stood 3rd from the back, which told her the geometry had been deliberate, close enough to direct, far enough to deny. The 2 men at the front carried torches. The 3rd held a crowbar, its iron head resting on his shoulder with the casual weight of a tool, not a weapon, which was the specific lie the whole arrangement was telling. Wren stood in the doorway with both hands visible, nothing in either one. She looked past the front men directly at Harp. He was the only one whose face she wanted, because faces tell you what the rehearsal missed. What she saw was not cruelty. It was the expression of a man who has convinced himself that what he is doing is necessary, which is more dangerous than cruelty because it is self-sustaining. Cruelty knows what it is. Necessity believes it has no choice. She reached into her coat pocket, took out the folded pages, 12 of them, dense with her smallest handwriting, the records she'd been keeping since October, alongside Metz's documented conversations, copied out clean the previous evening when she'd understood that this night was arriving. She held them out toward the group, not toward Harp specifically. "Before anyone says anything," she said, her voice carrying the same quality it had when she read coordinates aloud from a survey document, precise without inflection, assuming the listener was capable of following, "I want to read you something." One of the front men looked at the papers, looked at the torch in his own hand. The 2 things seemed briefly to be in a conversation he wasn't managing. She read, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of information that needs to be absorbed. The dates, the names, the amounts she had given to whom when. Then Metz's entries, the questions Harp had asked verbatim on 4 separate occasions about her roof structure, its contents, its vulnerabilities, the heat characteristics of its sheathing boards. The entry dated November 18th, the final line in the shaking hand. When she finished, the porch was quiet in the specific way of a space where something has been said that cannot be unsaid. She looked at Harp. He had not moved. His expression had shifted. The necessity had developed a fault line, something that was not quite shame, but was shame's structural precursor. I have a copy of these pages in my cellar, she said, sealed in a tin, addressed to the editor of the Idaho Statesman in Boise with a letter of explanation. If this cabin is damaged or anyone on my property is harmed or my supply is taken by force, that tin will be delivered by Patrick O'Shea, who knows where it is. She looked at the front men, then back at Harp. O'Shea is currently at the tree line. He has been there since the torches appeared. A silence. Then from the darkness at the eastern tree line, O'Shea's whistled 2 notes low-high present. The man with the crowbar lowered it from his shoulder. Not dramatically, not in surrender, just lowered it the way you lower a weight when the reason for carrying it has become unclear. Harp stepped forward through the group, which parted for him with the automatic deference of people who have organized themselves around a center of gravity. He came to the base of the porch steps. In the torchlight, his face had a quality she hadn't seen before. Compressed, reduced, the face of a man doing arithmetic that isn't coming out the way he'd planned. "You've got nothing to spare," he said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, stripped of the pleasant wrapping he usually applied to every proposition. "You've given most of it away. I've given what I could to the people who needed it most. My family is cold." Something moved across his face, genuine, she thought, the first genuine thing she'd seen from him. "My supply is short. I made a mistake in August, a financial decision that—" He stopped. The admission was costing him more than he'd budgeted for it. "I have a wife. I have 2 boys." Wren looked at him for a long moment. The torchlight moved in the wind, throwing his shadow in different directions. "Then you should have come to my door alone," she said 2 weeks ago, and told me that. He had nothing to say to this. The truth of it was too simple to argue with. She looked past him at the other 4 men, their faces in the torchlight showing various degrees of the same thing. Cold, tired, frightened, willing to have done something tonight that they would not be able to explain well in the morning. Not bad men, men in a bad winter who had followed the largest force available. "Go home," she said. "All of you. If you need wood, come back tomorrow, one at a time, and we'll talk about what I can give." She looked at each face in turn. "Tonight is over." They went. Harp last turning without the particular deliberateness of a man making a point, just turning the way a man turns when he is simply done, reduced to his true size, by the evening no longer a force, just a person walking home through snow. She watched until the torches were absorbed by the dark. Then she went inside, closed the door, stood with her back against it for a moment in the silence. From the floorboard came Eli's voice, muffled but distinct. 212. "Is it over?" She pressed her boot heel against the board, twice the signal they'd agreed on in September, 2 taps for yes. Then she went to the hearth, put 2 more logs on the fire, sat in the chair, held Jasper, while Sadie came up from the hatch with Eli. Both of them blinking in the firelight, with the expressions of people surfacing from underwater. She did not tell them what had been said on the porch. There would be time for that. What mattered now was the warmth the fire drawing steady, the roof intact above them. She did not sleep that night. Not from fear. The fear had been discharged with the decision to open the door, and what remained was a different kind of alertness, cleaner, less anxious, more like vigil. She sat with the lamp low and Metz's tin box on the table beside the journal, and she thought about what the morning would bring, which was the particular arithmetic of a supply that had been generous for other people now needing to be sufficient for 4. The morning brought fire. Not from her chimney, from the western edge of the valley where the Merritt place sat in the low ground between 2 ridges. She smelled it before she saw it, wood smoke with a different quality than chimney smoke, thicker with an acrid undertone that meant something structural was burning something that wasn't meant to burn. She was outside with her coat half buttoned when the glow appeared above the western tree line, orange against a sky that was still dark at its highest point. She stood in the snow and looked at it. She had given Dorothy Merritt wood twice, had told her about the floor runners, the banked fire technique, had explained the difference between a fire that produces heat you can live in and a fire that produces heat you can survive. She thought about this standing in the cold with the glow growing at the western horizon, and she understood in the way you understand things that arrive complete. Wallace Merritt had tried kerosene on wet wood in the dark of a December night, and the wall had caught, and Dorothy was not going to make it out of that. She knew this with a certainty that had no comfortable source. Not premonition, just the logical terminus of the circumstances she'd been watching accumulate for weeks. She was right. She found out in the morning, confirmed by Aldous Peck, who came to her door gray-faced, the news carried in the set of his shoulders before he said a word. The fire did not come to her cabin that night. It came 4 nights later. She knew it was coming, not the specific night, but the general approach, the way, a pressure system, by the way, the air changes before the clouds arrive. The community's grief over Dorothy Merritt had curdled in the specific way that grief curdles when people need someone to blame, and the actual cause is too diffuse to hold. Wallace Merritt had used kerosene on wet wood, but wet wood and insufficient supply were conditions that pointed back toward Wren in the moral accounting of people who were cold and frightened and needed the story to have a shape. She spent the day before the fire doing 3 things. She moved the last 12 logs from the cavity into the crawl space beneath the floorboards, stacking them along the clay-packed side wall she'd insulated in September with wool batting and sawdust fill. She transferred the heated bricks, 4 of them, riverstone dense, each one a day's warmth, when wrapped in wool from the firebox surround into the crawl space as well, setting them on the wooden platform she'd built for the purpose. Then she showed Sadie the back passage exit, a low door cut into the crawl space's north wall, hidden behind a false beam face opening 3 feet outside the cabin's foundation under a cedar overhang that would be largely invisible in snow. Sadie listened to all of this with the focused attention of a girl who had learned 1 month ago in a frozen trench the specific cost of not paying attention. "If I tell you to go in," Wren said, "take Jasper, take Eli, take the wool bundle on the left shelf. Don't come out the back until you hear 2 taps or until the air gets difficult." She looked at Sadie's face, at the steadiness there. Not courage exactly, more like the absence of the luxury of its opposite. "You understand." Sadie looked back at her with the gray eyes of someone who has already been through the worst thing and has discovered that surviving it does not make you fragile, it makes you specific. "I understand. 2 taps or bad air." The men came at 10 in the evening. 6 of them she could hear the difference from 5 by the combined weight of steps and snow. She had the lamp down to its lowest output, which from outside would make the cabin look dark, occupied only by embers. She had pulled the curtains on both windows an hour earlier, slowly, in the way you move when you don't want the movement to register as decision. She sent Sadie, Eli, and Jasper into the hatch at 9:30. Eli went last, pausing with the hatchboard in his hand to look at her with the particular expression he had: not fear, not bravery, something between and beyond both, the expression of a child who trusts the preparation, even when the preparation's moment has arrived. She pressed the board down behind him, stood on it, heard the first boot hit the porch. They did not knock. The door came in on the second shoulder. She heard the latch give, felt the cold enter the room like a third presence. Boots on the floor, voices overlapping someone's torch, casting moving light through the open door and up the walls. She was not in the room. She had moved to the corner behind the door's swing path 2 minutes before they arrived, which put her 6 inches from the nearest man's elbow when the door opened. She stepped out through the door behind them while they were spreading into the room. She walked to the water barrel at the cabin's east corner, moving without hurry through the snow, and she filled the bucket she'd left there in the afternoon. She carried it back to the door, set it on the porch boards within reach, then stood at the door frame and listened. They were in the loft. She could hear the boards of the cavity hatches being worked, the specific sound of the first catch yielding, then the confusion of the second catch not yielding, then a different kind of force being applied, wood beginning to give. A voice said, "She's burned it all. There's nothing up here." Followed by another voice, harder, "There has to be something." The sound of hands slapping boards, the hollow sound of empty cavity sections. Then the sound of something breaking that was not a hatchboard. The torch. She heard it before she smelled it, the specific crack of a glass chimney, then the spill of oil, then the catch, the small concussive breath of ignition, finding fuel. A voice said something in a register that wasn't a curse, but was past one. Another voice, louder, "Out! Get out!" Smoke reached her at the door. She picked up the bucket, threw it through the door into the base of the nearest wall. Not at the fire itself, which was already moving up the interior wall face, but at the door frame's inner surface, soaking the wood that the fire would need to pass through to reach the door opening in the porch. Then she moved to the hatch, 3 feet from the door. The smoke was low yet below chest height, the fire still on the interior wall face. She pulled the hatch ring, 2 taps on the board below, 1, 2 deliberate even. Then she stepped back. The board lifted from below. Eli's face not frightened, just present, just there. She lifted him out, took Jasper from Sadie's arms through the hatch, set him on the snow outside the door in the 3 seconds it took Sadie to come up herself. Then she pulled the hatch closed, threw the second bucket over the hatch seam. She picked up Jasper. She walked away from the cabin in the direction of the basalt shelf, which was the direction she'd always known she would walk if it came to this. The 6 men were already gone. She could hear them at the tree line moving fast, their torches visible in the gaps between the pines diminishing. One of them had run directly into O'Shea's position at the eastern edge, which she learned later O'Shea had stepped aside, let him pass committed the face to memory. The fire took the roof. She watched it from the basalt shelf with Eli against her left side, Sadie against her right, Jasper in her arms, all 4 of them in the snow watching the roof she'd built consume itself. The cavity burned hot when it caught the dried wood that had kept them alive for 3 months, giving everything it had in one long exhalation of light. The chimney held. The foundation walls held. The crawl space below the floor sealed by the clay packing and the soaked hatch seam did not catch. She watched the roof burn without expression, cataloging what she was seeing, the way she cataloged everything, not from coldness, but from the understanding that grief without information is only half of what the moment requires. The snow saved the walls. It came off the basalt shelf in a slow, wind-driven curtain that hit the burning roof at angles the fire couldn't compensate for. And by 2 in the morning, the fire had consumed what it could. Reached the roof, the loft framing the upper wall faces, and stopped there. Spent. The walls stood. The floor stood. Below the floor, the crawl space held its warmth from the heated bricks, the wool insulation, the clay, the 12 logs she'd moved the previous afternoon. She pulled the hatch at dawn. The 4 heated bricks were still radiating. She felt it before she saw it, the warmth rising from the open hatch like a breath. Sadie went down first, took Jasper, positioned him between 2 of the wool-wrapped bricks. Eli followed. Wren went last, pulling the hatch closed above them. They stayed in the crawl space through the worst of the following day, all 4 of them in the narrow warmth, while the wind moved through the roofless cabin above them, and the temperature outside dropped to the lowest point of the entire winter. She knew it was the lowest point, not by measurement, her thermometer was destroyed with the loft, but by the sound the basalt shelf made in extreme cold, a low, barely audible settling tone she'd heard described in one of the territorial survey documents as occurring only below a certain temperature threshold. The shelf moaned once long in the early afternoon, then went silent. Jasper slept. Eli counted something silently, his lips moving. Sadie held the baby and looked at the clay-packed wall with an expression that had moved past fear into a kind of considered calm, the calm of someone deciding something about themselves. When Wren opened the hatch the following morning, Patrick O'Shea was standing in the roofless cabin with 2 other men, all 3 looking at the standing walls with the expressions of people recalibrating what they'd assumed was a total loss. O'Shea looked at her emerging from the floor, at Eli, at Sadie with Jasper. He said nothing for a moment. Then, the walls are sound. The foundation didn't move. I know. She climbed out, helped Eli up, reached back for Jasper. The crawl space stayed above freezing. He looked at the open hatch at the wool batting visible below at the brick platform. You moved the bricks down yesterday. The day before. He was quiet in the way O'Shea was quiet when he was revising an assessment. How long were you planning for this possibility? She handed Jasper to Sadie, looked at the standing walls, the open sky above them, the snow sifted across the floor that had been her ceiling. Since before I bought the land, you build for the worst case. The worst case is what tests whether you built correctly. The lumber arrived 4 days later, not from a single source, but from 7. She didn't ask where it came from. She saw O'Shea's wagon first, then the Hanley boys with a mule load of cut pine, then Peter Handley, who had not spoken to her once since her arrival in the valley, who pulled his wagon to the edge of her property, climbed down, began unloading boards without looking at her face. She let him work. She had learned that the only way to accept this kind of penance, without humiliating the penitent, was to treat it as what it was trying to be, useful. Sadie's father came on the 3rd day of rebuilding. Jonas Pruitt, 44 years old, frostbite, having taken 2 fingers from his left hand before they'd gotten him out the trench. Shelter's walls had partially held enough that he'd survived, though the cold had found what it could reach. He came with his remaining 8 fingers in a level in a set of carpenter's squares, and he worked from dawn until he could no longer see every day for 2 weeks, never speaking directly to Wren, doing the work in the particular way of a man paying a debt whose full amount he cannot calculate. Sadie watched her father from across the build site with an expression that was not simple. It was the expression of someone holding two true things simultaneously: what he had done, the torch he'd thrown in a moment of panicked, mistaken love. What he was doing now, the daily appearance, the careful work, the two-fingered grip on the level. She had not told Wren outright that it was her father who had thrown the torch. She didn't need to. Wren had understood it from the moment she'd heard his voice in the dark outside the cabin, the frantic, muffled cry of "Sadie, Sadie, you in there?" The voice of a man who believed his daughter was being held, not helped. Wren did not go to the sheriff. Not because she lacked evidence. She had O'Shea's witness account, the physical evidence of the pry bar, the documented pattern of Harp's escalation, but because the sheriff's jurisdiction ran to the county seat and back, and what Greystone Hollow needed was not an absent authority's verdict, but a present community's reckoning. These were not the same thing. She held the tin box with its addressed letter to the Idaho statesman for 2 weeks before she sent it. Not out of mercy toward Harp, she was precise about that, in her own thinking, careful not to dress practical strategy in the costume of virtue. She waited because she needed to see what Harp did with the 12 days after the fire. Whether he came to the build site, whether he sent anyone, whether his behavior in the vacuum of the fire's aftermath revealed the character that existed below the committee language and the pleasant expression. He did not come. He sent no one. His absence from the rebuilding was as legible as a signed statement. She sent the tin on the 14th day via O'Shea's eldest son making a trip to Harwick. She did not tell Harp she was sending it. She did not tell anyone except O'Shea, who received this information with a single nod and the expression of a man who has been waiting for the correct sequence of events and recognizes when it has arrived. The letter the Idaho Statesman published in the third week of January ran to 4 paragraphs. It did not sensationalize. It stated dates, names, documented exchanges, the committee's formation under false community emergency, the specific financial transaction that had created Harp's artificial shortage. Wren had not written it to destroy him. She had written it to create a record that could not be edited by memory or revised by the kind of communal narrative that tends to form around events once the danger has passed. Harp lost the Northern Timber lease. The deposit was not returned. The landowner, upon reading the letter, declined further association. 2 of the 5 committee members resigned in writing, and the committee dissolved without ceremony, its authority having been revealed as the thing it had always been borrowed from collective fear, not granted by collective trust. He stayed in the valley. She had not expected him to leave, and he did not. He contracted, quieted, moved through the community's daily life with reduced force, like a river after a dry summer, still there following the same course, simply carrying less than it once had. She watched this happen without satisfaction. Satisfaction would have required the outcome to have been in question, and she had not truly believed Harp was more powerful than the documented truth. She had only needed to survive long enough to deliver it. Peter Hanley asked her about the flue loop on a Wednesday morning in mid-February, standing in the half-built cabin with the new roof framing overhead. He was 40 years old, a capable carpenter who had spent 2 months mocking her design from a distance, and he asked about the copper loop with the specific humility of a man who has decided that being wrong at high cost is preferable to continuing to be wrong. She showed him the principle on a small section of demonstration boards she'd built, for the purpose she'd been expecting. The question had prepared for it, the way she prepared for most things that she could see coming. She walked him through the convection physics in the same plain terms Owen had used to explain mine ventilation: hot air rises, cool air fills the space. It vacates the loop, creates a continuous circuit that does its work without any moving parts. Hanley asked 3 intelligent questions. She answered them directly. When Eli appeared at his elbow to add a specific detail about the baffle angles that Wren had omitted, Hanley looked down at the 7-year-old and then looked at Wren with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen on an adult face in months. How old was he when his father died? Hanley's voice was quiet, not intrusive. 3. He looked at Eli again, who had moved on to scratching a diagram in the fresh lumber with his nail illustrating the airflow with arrows. His father teach you all this too? Eli looked up from his diagram. My father taught my mother. My mother taught me. He went back to the arrows. That's how it works. Hanley was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to work. The cabin went up in 12 days faster than the original because there were more hands, because the design was now understood by more people, because the valley had been educated by loss in the specific, irreversible way that only loss can teach. The new roof was higher at the ridge, the cavity wider, the hatch mechanism fitted by O'Shea, with the same two-catch system Wren had developed. The flue loop ran a longer circuit, this time along 3 faces of the upper frame, instead of 2 with baffles at each corner bend. Sadie drew the elevation plan for the addition, a small room off the east face, separate entrance, 8 by 10 feet, insulated with the same clay wool batting system as the main cavity. She did this one evening without announcing her intention, working at the table with Wren's survey instrument, in a piece of smooth board producing something that was not a professional drawing, but was precise in the ways that mattered. She set it in front of Wren the following morning without explanation. Wren looked at it for a while, looked at the separate entrance Sadie had drawn, looked at Sadie. "For whoever needs it," Sadie said. "Next winter, or the one after." Wren looked at the drawing again. "The roof pitch on the addition needs to be steeper. This angle will hold snow at the junction." Sadie took the board back, made the correction, set it down again. Wren went to the shelf, took down 3 cups, poured coffee into all 3. Set them on the table. Eli came in from outside, looked at the cup, sat down at his place, pulled the 3rd cup toward himself with both hands. Nobody said anything about the 3rd cup. Nobody needed to. Jonas Pruitt came on the 3rd Sunday in February. He did not come as part of the build crew. The cabin was finished. He came alone in the morning hat in both hands, standing at the door with the posture of a man who has been rehearsing something for a long time and is not confident in his delivery. "My daughter is here because of you," he said. His voice had the quality of someone who has located the essential thing and is going to say it before he loses the nerve. "Jasper is alive because of you." He stopped, started again. "I threw a torch at your cabin because I thought—" He stopped again. Whatever he had thought now seemed to him too foolish to finish. "I was wrong about what was happening. I was wrong about you." Wren looked at him, at the 2 fingers missing from his left hand, at his face, which had the particular quality of a face that has been through something and come out changed, not damaged, changed. "You were trying to get your daughter back," she said. He looked up. "You were wrong about the method," she said, "but you were not wrong about the impulse." She stepped back from the door. "Come in. Sadie's in the back." He went past her, and she heard from the addition room the sound of Sadie's voice, surprised. Then something past surprise, then quiet. She did not go to the doorway. She went to the hearth, built the fire up, began making the morning's bread, with the routine efficiency of someone who understands that the most respectful thing you can offer people in private moments is the simple continuation of ordinary life around them. Eli appeared beside her. He had been outside. Snow was still on his shoulders, melting fast in the cabin's warmth. "Is that Sadie's father?" he asked. "It is." He thought about this. "Is she glad he came?" Wren turned the dough. "She's something more complicated than glad. But yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you glad he came?" She looked at the dough in her hands, the simple, irreducible fact of flour and water and heat making something that hadn't existed before. "I'm glad he came back in the morning instead of in the dark. That's sufficient." The first quart of the new season's supply went into the cavity in August on a morning when the sky had that particular clarity that comes before the long shift, when the light is still summer, but the edge of it carries a message about what follows. She was on the roof with the first load when she heard a horse on the road, unfamiliar rhythm, not one of the valley's animals. Eli was below, passing logs up through the hatch. He stopped when the horse turned into the yard, looked at the rider, looked up at Wren on the roof. The man was dressed for travel, road dust on his coat despite the season a saddlebag that had been loaded and unloaded many times. He pulled up, looked at the cabin, at the roof structure, at the hatch system. Wren was working with the focused attention of someone who has come a specific distance to see a specific thing. "I'm looking for the woman who built the Firewood roof," he said. "Someone in Harwick said she'd be at this property." Eli looked up at Wren. She looked down at the man on the horse, then at the hatch in her hands, then at the load of wood still to be stacked. "Where are you from?" she asked. Helena, he reached into his saddlebag, produced a folded newspaper. Even from the roof, she could recognize the Idaho Statesman's masthead, the issue from January. Read about what happened here, about the design. He looked at the roof at the cavity section. She was working at the copper loop access fitting visible at the peak. I've got 3 neighbors lost wood last winter to damp. Another one lost a shed to mice. I want to understand how it works. She looked at the cavity, at the 8 logs still waiting to go in, at Eli below, who had set his load down and was watching the man with the direct assessing attention he brought to everything. She thought about Metz in the cold shop, his notes organized, his cash tin on the shelf, his last entry in a shaking hand. She thought about the difference between knowledge kept and knowledge given, not charity, not performance, but the simple physics of a thing that doesn't diminish when you share it. Owen had understood this about geology. The seam doesn't get smaller because you tell someone else where it runs. She looked at the man on the horse. Come back tomorrow, she said. I'll show you what I'm building this time. She went back to the cavity, fitted the next log into its place on the cedar runner, checked the airflow with the small paper strip she kept. For the purpose, watched it flutter in the slow, warm circulation of the loop. The log was dry, dense, full of stored summer heat that the winter would draw on the way water draws on a deep aquifer, slowly, sustainably, without exhausting the source. Eli passed up the next one. She fitted it beside the first. From the valley below came the sound of hammers, 4 of them now working in the rhythms of 4 separate crews, each one building something that had not existed in Greystone Hollow the previous spring. Not copies exactly. Variations, adaptations. The original principle, finding new expressions in the hands of people who had learned the hardest possible way that the principle was sound. She did not look down at the hammers. She did not need to see the thing to know it was there. She could feel it through the roof boards, the faint transmitted vibration of a valley that was for the first time in the memory of anyone who lived in it, building toward the winter instead of waiting for it to arrive. She stacked the next log, checked the seam, moved to the 3rd position. Below her, Eli handed up the next piece without being asked, timing it to her pace, the 2 of them working in the particular synchrony of people who have gotten very good at a thing by doing it a long time together. And the copper loop carried its warmth through the cavity in its slow, patient circuit, and the August sky held its late clarity above the ridge, and somewhere in the valley a 5th hammer joined the 4.